I thought I knew everything about my wife's family, until her sister showed up at my door late one night, drenched and desperate. What started as a simple favor spiraled into something I could never have imagined. The tension in her voice, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long, each moment felt like a line I couldn't afford to cross. But sometimes, temptation doesn't knock, it barges in. Laura had always been a part of our lives. As my wife Sarah's younger sister, she was like family furniture, always present but never someone I paid much attention to. She was bubbly, full of energy, and had a knack for lighting up a room with her infectious laughter. Over the years, she had become a constant at family gatherings, holidays, and weekend barbecues, effortlessly blending into the fabric of our lives. Sarah and I had been married for over a decade, and while our relationship wasn't perfect, it was steady. We had built a life together, careers, kids, a home filled with love and chaos. Our days revolved around schedules and responsibilities, the kind of routine that feels safe but occasionally suffocating. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. Laura, on the other hand, lived a different life. She was single, independent, and unapologetically carefree. She would often share stories of her dating adventures, her spontaneous trips, her latest career moves. Sarah admired her sister's boldness, and I found it endearing in a distant, detached way. To me, Laura was just that, Sarah's sister, nothing more, nothing less. But everything changed on a quiet Tuesday evening. Sarah had taken the kids to her parents' house for the weekend, leaving me alone for a few days. I had planned for a simple evening of watching TV and catching up on work when Laura called, her voice tinged with urgency. Her car had broken down nearby, and she needed a place to wait for the tow truck. Of course, I didn't hesitate. She was family, after all. When Laura arrived, she seemed different, not in an obvious way, but there was something in her demeanor that caught me off guard. She was dressed casually, her hair pulled back, but there was an ease about her that felt intentional. I told myself I was imagining things as we chatted about her car troubles and mundane topics. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't ignore the subtle shifts, the way her laughter lingered, the way her gaze held mine just a fraction too long. Looking back, I wish I had set clearer boundaries that night. But hindsight is always clearer than the moment itself. The morning after Laura stayed the night, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was reading too much into the night before. After all, she was family, and the circumstances had been perfectly innocent, hadn't they? When I finally dragged myself out of bed, I found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. She greeted me with a warm smile, sliding one of the mugs across the counter toward me. "Morning," she said, her voice casual. "I hope you don't mind, I made enough for both of us." "No problem," I replied, trying to match her nonchalance. But something about the moment felt off. Her demeanor was too relaxed, her smile lingering just a little too long. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. As we sipped our coffee, we fell into easy conversation, talking about her job, my work, and the kids. It felt normal, even comfortable, but there was an undertone I couldn't ignore. Then, as the conversation shifted, she caught me off guard. "You know," she said softly, "I've always felt like you're the one person in this family who really understands me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I forced a laugh, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Well, I guess I'm a pretty good listener." "No," she said, shaking her head slightly, her eyes locking onto mine. "It's more than that. You just get me." I didn't know how to respond. Was she just being sincere, or was there something more behind her words? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I scrambled for a way to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Before I could say anything, her phone buzzed. The tow truck was finally on its way. As she grabbed her things and prepared to leave, she turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for everything," she said. "Really? I owe you one." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "You're a good man, you know that?" The words echoed in my mind long after she left. Was she just being kind, or was there something beneath the surface? I couldn't be sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. A week later, Laura came over for a family dinner. Sarah had invited her, of course, and everything seemed perfectly normal at first. The kids ran around the house, filling it with laughter, while Sarah and Laura chatted in the kitchen. But I couldn't help noticing the subtle moments, Laura's hand brushing against mine as she passed me a dish, the way her gaze lingered just a little too long during a joke, the way her smile seemed to carry an unspoken question. As the night went on, I found myself avoiding her, keeping conversations short and focused. But even as I tried to maintain a safe distance, the tension was palpable. It wasn't just in my head anymore, there was something unspoken between us, something neither of us was willing to name. Later, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Laura caught me alone in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, her voice low. Do you ever feel like? I don't know, like life didn't turn out the way you thought it would? Her words stopped me in my tracks. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. She shrugged, her eyes downcast. Like you had all these plans and dreams, and then one day you wake up and realize none of it happened the way you wanted. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, I said finally, my voice hesitant. She nodded, her tone softer now. I guess. It's just. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong choices. Before I could say anything else, Sarah walked into the kitchen, laughing about something the kids had said. Laura straightened up, her usual cheerful demeanor snapping back into place. But as she left the room, I couldn't ignore the weight of her words, or the tension that lingered in her absence. The following days passed in a haze, but the subtle tension between Laura and me lingered like an unspoken secret. I found myself hyper-aware of her presence during family gatherings, watching for every lingering glance, every accidental touch. I hated that I was noticing these things, and even more, I hated the part of me that wasn't entirely opposed to them. It was a Saturday afternoon when the situation took an unexpected turn. Sarah had taken the kids to the park, leaving me alone in the garage to sort through some overdue projects. The rhythmic hum of the drill and the familiar scent of wood and oil were almost enough to drown out my thoughts. Almost. Then, I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. I glanced up and froze when I saw Laura stepping out of her car, her expression unreadable. My stomach dropped as she walked toward me with a hesitant smile. Hey, she said softly. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I wiped my hands on a rag, trying to keep my voice casual. Sarah's not here, I said quickly. She took the kids to the park. I know, Laura said, her eyes meeting mine. I actually came to see you. Her words hit me like a freight train, and I struggled to keep my composure. Laura, I began, my voice firmer now, I'm not sure this is a good idea. What isn't? She asked, her voice shaky as she stepped closer. Talking? Being honest. This, I said, gesturing between us. Whatever this is, it needs to stop. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked vulnerable in a way that caught me off guard. I'm not trying to make things weird, she said quietly. I don't know who else to talk to. Laura, I said, my tone softening despite myself, you can always talk to Sarah. She's your sister? Her gaze dropped to the floor. It's not the same, she whispered. You're the only one who really listens. Who really gets me? I sighed, leaning against the workbench as I tried to process what was happening. Every instinct screamed at me to end the conversation, to put as much distance between us as possible. But something in her voice, in the way she looked at me, made it impossible to walk away. Laura, I said finally, you're not alone. Whatever you're feeling, you can get through it. She nodded, but instead of stepping back, she reached out and placed her hand on mine. The contact was brief but electric, sending a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I pulled my hand away quickly, stepping back as I struggled to steady my breath. I think you should go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, sadness, regret, maybe even longing. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable. Before I could respond, she turned and walked back to her car. I stood there, watching as she drove away, my chest tight with a mixture of guilt and confusion. I told myself it was over, that the moment had passed, but deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The next time I saw Laura was at another family dinner. Sarah had invited her, of course, and everything seemed normal on the surface. But beneath the laughter and chatter, the tension between us simmered like a barely contained storm. At one point, Sarah asked me to grab something from the garage. Before I could stand, Laura volunteered to help. My heart raced as we walked to the garage together, the silence between us thick and heavy. Once we were alone, she closed the door behind her and turned to face me. We need to talk, she said, her voice firm. There's nothing to talk about, I said, keeping my tone low. Whatever you're feeling, it has to stop. She folded her arms, her expression unreadable. I'm not asking for anything from you, she said softly. I just need to know if I'm the only one who feels this way. I stared at her, my mind racing. I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that there was nothing between us. But the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I couldn't deny the pull between us, the unspoken tension that had been growing since that night she stayed over. Laura, I said finally, my voice shaking, you're going through something, and it's making you see things that aren't there. Don't do that, she said, her voice breaking. Don't make me feel like I'm crazy. I know what I feel, and I know you feel it too. Before I could respond, the garage door creaked open, and Sarah walked in, a cheerful smile on her face. Everything okay in here? She asked, glancing between us. Yeah, I said quickly, grabbing the box she had sent me for. We were just grabbing this. Laura smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Just catching up, she said lightly. As we walked back to the house, I could feel Laura's tension radiating off her, and I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension between Laura and me had reached its breaking point, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave way. I tried to bury myself in work, family routines, and my relationship with Sarah, but it was impossible to ignore the growing weight of everything that had happened. Every glance Laura and I exchanged felt like a loaded secret, a constant reminder of the invisible line we'd already come dangerously close to crossing. One quiet evening, when Sarah and the kids were out running errands, I found myself alone in the house. I had just settled onto the couch with a beer when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught my attention. My heart sank as I saw Laura's car outside, her silhouette visible through the window. Before I could process what was happening, she knocked on the door. Taking a deep breath, I opened it to find her standing there, a nervous smile on her face. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Laura, this isn't a good idea," I said, trying to keep my tone firm. "Sarah will be home any minute." "I won't stay long," she said quickly. "I just need to say this." I stepped aside reluctantly, letting her in. She walked into the living room and stood in the center of the room, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. I stayed near the door, unsure of what to do or say. "Look," she began, her voice shaky, "I know things have been weird between us. And I know I'm the one who made it that way." "Laura," I interrupted, "you don't need to explain. I think we both know." "No," she cut me off, her voice stronger now. "Let me finish. I can't keep pretending that this isn't happening. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this connection between us." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was imagining things, but I couldn't. The truth was, I had felt it too. From that first night when she stayed over, there had been something unspoken between us, something I had been too scared to name. "This isn't right," I said finally, my voice low. "You're Sarah's sister, and I'm her husband. This, whatever this is, it can't happen." "I know," Laura said, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But that doesn't make it any easier to stop feeling this way." She took a step closer, and I could feel the air shift between us. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said softly. "I just need to know, am I the only one who feels this?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted to tell her no, to end this once and for all, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at her, the weight of her question hanging heavy between us. "No," I said finally, the word slipping out before I could stop it. "You're not?" The silence that followed was deafening. Laura's expression was a mix of relief and heartbreak, and I could feel my chest tighten as I realized the gravity of what I had just admitted. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't stop thinking about you, but I don't want to ruin everything." "You're not going to ruin anything," I said quickly, stepping forward instinctively. "We can't let this go any further." For a moment, we stood there, the space between us crackling with unspoken tension. Then, as if on cue, the sound of the garage door opening shattered the moment. Sarah and the kids were home. Laura's eyes widened, and she stepped back, her face flushing with panic. "I should go," she whispered, grabbing her bag. She slipped out the back door just as Sarah walked in, a grocery bag in each hand. "Hey," Sarah said cheerfully, setting the bags on the counter. "What have you been up to?" "Nothing," I said quickly, my voice too tight. "Just watching some TV?" She gave me a curious look but didn't press further. As she busied herself with the groceries, I tried to calm the pounding in my chest, hoping she hadn't noticed anything unusual. But Sarah wasn't oblivious. A few days later, as we sat together on the couch after the kids had gone to bed, she turned to me with a serious expression. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her tone careful. "Of course," I said, my stomach sinking. "Is everything okay between us?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "You've been distant lately, and I feel like, I don't know, like something's off." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what was happening without destroying everything we had built? "There's nothing wrong," I said finally, forcing a smile. "I've just been stressed with work." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on mine. "If there's something you need to talk about, you can tell me," she said softly. "Of course," I said, hating the lie even as I said it. But the truth had a way of surfacing. A week later, during another family dinner, Sarah noticed the tension between Laura and me. She didn't say anything at the time, but later that night, she confronted me. "Is there something going on with you and Laura?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. I froze, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not stupid," she said, her voice shaking. "I've seen the way she looks at you. The way you avoid her. Just tell me the truth." In that moment, I knew I couldn't lie anymore. There's nothing physical, I said, my voice trembling. But there's been tension. I didn't mean for it to happen, and I'm so sorry. Her face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry. How could you let this happen? She whispered. I don't know, I said, my voice breaking. I made a mistake, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, Sarah, don't give up on us. But as she walked away, I realized the damage had already been done. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same. The days following Sarah's discovery were some of the hardest of my life. The house, once filled with the warmth of laughter and routine, became a cold, silent void. Sarah spoke to me only when necessary, her words clipped and devoid of the tenderness that had once been so effortless between us. She avoided my gaze, and when she wasn't tending to the kids, she disappeared into our bedroom, shutting the door behind her. I tried to give her space, hoping time would ease her anger and hurt. But every time I saw her puffy eyes and red cheeks, evidence of tears she wouldn't let me see, the guilt tore through me like a blade. I had betrayed her trust, not with an action, but with the feelings I had allowed to grow, unchecked and unspoken. And though I had never acted on them, the emotional betrayal was enough to fracture our marriage. Laura kept her distance, as promised. There were no more unexpected visits, no lingering texts or calls. But her absence didn't make things easier. If anything, it heightened the tension. Sarah's mind filled in the gaps I didn't have the courage to explain, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. I could see it in the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if trying to gauge whether I was hiding something else. One evening, about a week after our confrontation, Sarah broke the silence. She found me sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at the television. Without a word, she sat across from me, her posture rigid and her expression guarded. I need answers, she said finally, her voice steady but cold. I need to know how this happened. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I placed them on my knees. It started the night her car broke down, I admitted. She stayed over, and I noticed something was different. At first, I ignored it, but over time, the tension grew. I swear, I never acted on it, Sarah. I never crossed that line. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice cracked as she asked, but you wanted to, didn't you? I hesitated, knowing that any answer I gave would hurt her. I didn't want to feel anything, I said softly. But I can't deny that I did. And for that, I am so sorry. She let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her eyes. Do you know how humiliating this is? My own sister, my husband, she shook her head, unable to finish the thought. I trusted both of you. You still can, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. Nothing physical happened, Sarah. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness that I never should have let happen. She stood abruptly, pacing the room. It doesn't matter if nothing happened physically. You let it get this far. You let yourself feel something for her. How do I move past that? How do I ever look at either of you the same way? Her words cut deep, and I realized that I didn't have an answer. How could I ask her to forgive me when I wasn't even sure I deserved it? The next day, Sarah packed a bag and took the kids to her parents' house. She said she needed time to think, and I didn't argue. Watching her leave, the kids' confused faces staring back at me from the car window, was one of the most painful moments of my life. In the silence that followed, I tried to focus on repairing myself. I reached out to a therapist, someone who could help me unravel the choices I had made and understand why I had allowed myself to fall into such a destructive pattern. The sessions were eye-opening, forcing me to confront truths about myself that I had long buried, my fear of stagnation, my longing for validation, and the cracks in my relationship with Sarah that I had ignored for too long. Laura stayed away completely during this time. Sarah had made it clear she didn't want to see or hear from her, and I respected her wishes. I didn't reach out to Laura, either. Whatever had existed between us needed to end for good, and I knew that any contact would only deepen the wounds. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Sarah began to open the door to communication again. It started with short, stilted phone calls about the kids and logistics, but over time, the conversations became more personal. She asked about the therapy, about what I had learned, and I could sense a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Her expression was softer than it had been in months, though still guarded. I'm not saying I'm ready to forgive you, she began, but I can see you're trying. And I appreciate that. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I know I have a lot to prove, and I'll do whatever it takes. She nodded, folding her hands on the table. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, but I'm willing to try, if you are. I am, I said immediately. More than anything, rebuilding our marriage was not a quick or easy process. It required hard conversations, tears, and a level of honesty that was often painful but necessary. Through it all, I learned that love isn't just about passion or romance, it's about commitment, trust, and the willingness to fight for each other, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. Months had passed since the night everything fell apart, and while the wounds of betrayal still lingered, Sarah and I were slowly finding our way back to each other. Rebuilding trust was a grueling process, but it was one we were both committed to. For the first time in years, we were having honest conversations, not just about what had happened, but about the deeper issues that had been festering beneath the surface of our marriage. Through therapy, I began to understand the cracks in our relationship that I had ignored for so long. I had taken Sarah's trust for granted, assuming that love alone would sustain us without effort or communication. But love wasn't enough, not without respect, honesty, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths together. Sarah's own growth during this time was equally profound. She admitted that she had overlooked the growing distance between us, focusing so much on the kids and day-to-day responsibilities that she hadn't noticed how isolated we had become from each other. While she was still deeply hurt by what had happened with Laura, she began to see that our problems had been years in the making. Laura, true to her word, stayed away. She moved to a different city, leaving Sarah and me the space we needed to heal. Sarah had confronted her once, shortly after everything came to light. It was a conversation filled with anger, tears, and the kind of finality that only comes from a deep betrayal. Laura apologized, but the damage was done, and Sarah made it clear that she needed time, if not forever, to rebuild her trust in her sister. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on the patio, the same place where so much had unraveled, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever get back to what we were before?" she asked softly. I took a deep breath, staring into the flickering firelight. "I don't think we can go back," I admitted. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we can build something stronger, something that doesn't rely on pretending everything is perfect?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I want to believe that," she said. "I really do." We sat there in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around us. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I might have hoped for, but it was real. It was honest. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page. The experience taught me lessons I would carry for the rest of my life. I learned that trust isn't a given, it's a fragile thing, built through countless small acts of love and respect. I learned that love doesn't mean never making mistakes, it means having the courage to own up to them and the humility to make amends. And most importantly, I learned that boundaries are not just about protecting relationships, they're about protecting the people within them. To anyone listening to this story, my takeaway is simple: never take the people you love for granted. Relationships require work, vulnerability, and a commitment to choosing each other every single day. Temptation and distractions will always exist, but it's your actions, and your respect for those you care about, that define who you are. As Sarah and I walked back inside that night, I realized that while we still had a long way to go, we were heading in the right direction. And for that, I was deeply grateful. If you were in Sarah's shoes, could you ever forgive such a betrayal? Or do you think some lines can never be uncrossed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that explore the complexities of love, trust, and temptation. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned for another gripping tale.